Have you lost your mind? That farm is nothing but worthless wasteland. Everyone tried to stop the old soldier when he spent his life savings to buy the dilapidated property on the edge of town. But months later, when a convoy of historians arrived and set up research tents around the yard, they all finally understood he had preserved something the entire nation had nearly forgotten. Type 1 if you believe there are veterans still protecting their country in ways no one could imagine. Welcome to QH. Let's uncover what really happened. Frank Donovan, 74, was a Marine Corps veteran who had served in Vietnam in 1969. Discharged with the rank of sergeant, his military records showed 3 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star, decorations he kept in a shoebox rather than displaying them. After the war, he lived quietly in rural Virginia, repairing farm equipment and heavy machinery until retirement forced his calloused hands into unwelcome idleness. His wife Martha had passed 5 years earlier, leaving him alone in a small house that felt increasingly empty. One May morning, Frank stunned the sleepy town of Millbrook when he signed papers purchasing the abandoned Creekside Farm, 20 acres of overgrown fields, rotting outbuildings, and a sagging farmhouse that hadn't been inhabited since the early 90s. The property had been on the market for nearly a decade with no takers. Most locals considered it worthless, too small for commercial farming, too run down for residential use, and too far from town to be convenient. "Frank, you can't be serious," said Walter Green, his neighbor of 30 years, as they stood at the edge of the weed-choked driveway. "Your knees can barely handle your own yard. What are you going to do with all this?" Others were less kind. At the diner where Frank had eaten breakfast every Thursday for decades, conversation would halt when he entered, only to resume in hushed tones as he took his usual seat at the counter. "Throwing good money after bad," muttered Bill Taylor from the hardware store. "That place hasn't grown anything but weeds since Nixon was president." Even Frank's son, Michael, flew in from Chicago to try changing his father's mind. "Dad, this is your retirement fund we're talking about," he argued, gesturing at the crumbling chimney of the farmhouse. "You're not young anymore. You need that money for medical care, not this." Frank listened to their concerns with the same patient expression he'd worn when commanding young Marines through jungle terrain, the face of a man who knew exactly what he was doing, even if no one else did. "I'm not buying it to get rich," he finally explained, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm buying it to keep a promise." Each day after completing the purchase, Frank drove his aging pickup to the property before dawn. He cleared brush, patched the roof, and rebuilt stone walls, documenting everything in a weathered notebook filled with precise handwriting. Neighbors driving past would slow down to watch the old Marine methodically reclaiming the land from neglect. Some stopped to offer help, which Frank politely declined. This was his mission alone. "It's a shame," said Reverend Michaels to his congregation one Sunday. Frank Donovan was always such a sensible man. But Frank remained undeterred. When the local newspaper ran a small piece about the old soldier's folly, Frank didn't even bother reading it because he remembered what no one else in Millbrook knew. "Old Creekside was where my company took emergency shelter for 3 nights in '68 during training," he told his reflection as he shaved each morning, "and where Sergeant Conrad made me promise before he shipped out to Vietnam never to return." 3 months into his solo restoration project, Frank uncovered the remains of a stone marker near what had once been a barn. He knelt beside it despite his protesting knees, carefully brushing away decades of soil and vegetation. The inscription was nearly worn away, but Frank didn't need to read it. He knew what it said. "If you believe battlefield promises can live on for half a century, stay with us." What no one in Millbrook realized was that Frank had kept a faded tactical map from 1969, carefully preserved in plastic and locked in his home safe. The map marked the coordinates of a temporary supply point that had been hastily established on this very property during a little-documented military exercise before his unit deployed overseas. Sergeant James Conrad, Frank's commanding officer and closest friend during those years, had made an unusual request during their last night stateside. Standing at the edge of what was then a working farm, Conrad had gripped Frank's shoulder tight. "If I don't make it back, find a way to protect this place, Donovan," he had said, his breath visible in the cold night air. "It saved our boys once, might need to again someday." Frank had nodded, not fully understanding but unwilling to question the sergeant who had already saved his life twice during training accidents. 3 months later, Conrad stepped on a landmine outside Da Nang. Frank received the news while recovering from his own wounds in a field hospital. For 50 years, Frank had kept his promise in the only way he could, by tracking the property's ownership from a distance. When the last owner died without heirs and the bank put it up for auction, Frank liquidated his retirement accounts and made an offer before it could be divided for development. On a sweltering July afternoon, while clearing debris around what had once been a well, Frank's shovel struck something metallic. Dropping to his knees, he carefully excavated what appeared to be a military ammunition box, buried at least 3 feet down and sealed with weatherproof tape. Inside, protected from the elements, he found a unit patch from the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, a yellowed photograph showing 6 men in uniform standing before a hastily constructed shelter, a handwritten document detailing movement routes and the names of 4 Marines listed as MIA in subsequent action, and most surprisingly, a letter addressed simply, "To whoever finds this," delivered to USMC Historical Division. Frank's hands trembled as he read the letter's contents. Conrad had documented something during those 3 days at Creekside, something that had never made it into official record. The letter referenced critical intelligence and alternate extraction points established during what was supposed to be a simple training exercise. That evening, Frank scanned the documents and emailed them to retired Colonel Howard Brennan, a former buddy who now worked as a consultant for the National Archives. Frank's message was typically brief. "Found this on the old Creekside property. Conrad left it, might matter to someone." 6 days later, Frank's ancient flip phone rang while he was repairing the farmhouse porch. The caller identified himself as Dr. Marcus Whitley from the U.S. Military History Institute. "Mr. Donovan, what you've discovered may be significantly more important than you realized," Whitley explained, his voice taut with controlled excitement. "Sergeant Conrad's documents appear to reference a contingency evacuation plan that was established during the height of the Cold War, a civilian protection protocol that was never officially acknowledged." "Conrad always was thinking 3 steps ahead," Frank replied quietly. "May I ask why you purchased this specific property, Mr. Donovan?" Frank gazed across the overgrown fields to where the stone marker stood. "A promise to a dead Marine, sir. Nothing more complicated than that." "Well, your promise may have preserved a crucial piece of American military history," Dr. Whitley continued. "Would you be willing to allow a small team to examine the property? There may be additional artifacts or structures that could help complete some very incomplete historical record." Frank agreed with one condition. "The land stays mine. I promised Conrad I'd protect it." "Of course, Mr. Donovan, we're historians, not developers." Word of the impending visit spread through Millbrook like wildfire. The same neighbors who had questioned Frank's sanity now drove slowly past the farm, curiosity replacing their previous derision. The local paper, which had mocked his purchase, now requested an interview that Frank politely declined. "Don't much care for explaining myself," he told the eager young reporter who caught him at the general store. "Never have." Michael called from Chicago, having heard about the historians through the family grapevine. "Dad, what's really going on with that farm?" he asked. Frank sat on his porch swing, phone pressed to his ear, watching fireflies emerge in the evening light. "Jim Conrad saved my life in Vietnam," he said finally. "When a man like that asks you to remember something, you remember it, even if it takes 50 years. The night before the historians were scheduled to arrive, Frank sat alone at his kitchen table. Conrad's letter spread before him. One passage stood out, written in the steady hand of a man who somehow knew he wouldn't return. This location was designated Emergency Civilian Collection Point Echo 7. If primary evac routes from DC were compromised, this is where they'd bring the children. We prepared it, but pray to God it's never needed. Someone should remember. Someone should keep watch." Frank folded the letter carefully. "Still keeping watch, Jim," he murmured to the empty room, "just like I promised. Have you ever seen something seemingly meaningless turn out to be a missing piece of national history?" 1 month after Frank's discovery, a convoy of vehicles bearing government license plates turned onto the rutted driveway of Creekside Farm. 7 historians, 3 military site assessment specialists, and 2 document preservation experts emerged regarding the overgrown property with expressions of reverent anticipation. Whitley, a slender man with wire-rimmed glasses in the erect posture of a former military officer, approached Frank with an extended hand. "Mr. Donovan, thank you for allowing us access. I cannot overstate the potential significance of what you've preserved here." Frank nodded, uncomfortable with the formality, but unwilling to dismiss the importance these educated people placed on Conrad's legacy. He watched as they unloaded equipment, ground-penetrating radar, metal detectors, sample collection kits, and photographic gear. Within hours, the neglected farm had transformed into a carefully gridded archaeological site. The team worked methodically, referring constantly to Frank's tactical map and Conrad's document. They marked areas with colored flags, measured distances with laser equipment, and photographed everything from multiple angles. On the second day, while the town of Millbrook buzzed with speculation, the regional newspaper ran its first front-page story: "Local Veterans' Foolish Purchase May Be Historic Cold War Site." The article explained how Frank's seemingly irrational decision had potentially preserved a piece of hidden American history, an undocumented emergency evacuation site established during a period of heightened nuclear tension. People who had dismissed Frank as a foolish old man now approached him at the general store with questions and awkward apologies. Frank accepted both with the same quiet dignity, neither seeking vindication nor harboring resentment. Just keeping a promise became his standard response. On the fourth day of investigation, the team made their first significant physical discovery. Using metal detectors in the area Frank had identified as the former supply storage point, they uncovered two buried footlockers containing emergency provisions, military-grade medical supply, water purification tablets, and communication equipment, all still sealed in their original packaging. These were left intentionally, Dr. Whitley explained to Frank, not forgotten or abandoned, deliberately cached for potential future use. Frank ran a weathered hand over the footlocker's rusted surface. Conrad mentioned setting up insurance policies, said it was off books but necessary. As the investigation continued, the true purpose of Creekside Farm began to emerge through the fragmentary evidence. What had appeared to be an ordinary rural property had been secretly designated as one of several last resort shelters, locations selected for their geographical features, natural water sources, and defensible position. These sites were prepared to receive and protect civilians, particularly children from nearby urban centers, in the event of a nuclear strike on Washington, D.C. Unlike official shelters, these locations were known only to select military units, designed to operate outside standard chains of command if conventional systems collapsed. The most poignant discovery came on the seventh day. The team's ground-penetrating radar identified an anomaly near the stone marker Frank had uncovered months earlier. Careful excavation revealed a waterproof tube containing a handwritten letter from Sergeant Conrad. The team's document specialist carefully extracted the fragile paper while wearing conservation gloves. The letter's contents brought a hushed silence over the gathered researcher. "If I don't make it back, I hope someone will protect this place, as witness to what we couldn't officially acknowledge. We prepared 43 similar sites across the eastern seaboard, each connected by routes only our unit memorized. Official records will never show them. Too much risk of compromise. But someone should remember. Someone should know that even when the world seemed ready to end, we were still planning to save what could be saved." Frank stood motionless as Dr. Whitley read the words aloud, his weathered face revealing nothing of the emotions churning beneath. Here was confirmation that Conrad's request hadn't been the rambling of a scared young man facing deployment. It had been a deliberate attempt to preserve knowledge that bureaucracy had deemed too sensitive for official documentation. 2 days later, representatives from the United States Army Center of Military History and the National Historic Battlefield Preservation Trust arrived at Creekside. After touring the property and reviewing the team's preliminary findings, they delivered unprecedented news. The farm would be added to the Register of Undocumented Historic Military Sites, a designation that provided both protection and recognition without transferring ownership. A small memorial and information center would be established on site, preserving both the physical location and the story of the men who had prepared it. Most significantly, efforts would begin immediately to locate the other 42 sites mentioned in Conrad's letter before development or neglect erased them completely. As the officials delivered this news, Frank stood at the edge of his property, looking out over the land he had purchased. Despite universal discouragement, for the first time since Martha's passing, he felt a weight lift from his shoulder. The local residents, who had once mocked his decision, now viewed Frank with a mixture of respect and awe. Walter Green, his longtime neighbor, stopped by with a freshly baked apple pie and an awkward attempt at an apology. "Don't think I've ever been so wrong about anything," Frank Walter admitted, shuffling his feet on the newly repaired porch. "Calling you foolish when you were being the opposite." Frank accepted the pie with a slight nod. "You weren't wrong based on what you—" "I didn't know the whole story myself until recently, but you bought it anyway," Walter pressed, "just on a promise to your sergeant." Frank looked past his neighbor to where the research team was carefully mapping the foundation of what had once been a barn. "Some promises matter more than money or comfort, Walter. Some debts can't be measured in dollars. The media attention grew as word spread beyond Millbrook. Reporters from national networks set up temporary studios in the town's only hotel. Veterans groups organized visits. Historians scheduled lectures on the overlooked aspects of Cold War preparedness. Through it all, Frank maintained his daily routine, rising before dawn, working on the property until dusk, and taking his solitary dinner on the porch as fireflies emerged. The only noticeable change was the gradual straightening of his posture, as though the fulfillment of his promise had somehow reversed the physical toll of carrying it for so long. When asked by a persistent reporter if he felt vindicated by the discoveries, Frank's response became the headline of the resulting feature. Vindication implies I needed others to validate my choice. I didn't. A promise between soldiers needs no witness to remain binding. In late September, as the research team prepared to conclude their initial investigation, Dr. Whitley presented Frank with their preliminary report, a leather-bound volume documenting everything they had discovered about Creekside Farm's secret history. Your sergeant would be proud, Miss Donovan, Dr. Whitley said, handing over the report. Because of your loyalty, we've already located 3 more of the sites mentioned in his records. 2 were days away from being bulldozed for development. Frank accepted the book with calloused hands that had spent a lifetime building, repairing and now preserving. Conrad always said, history doesn't remember the preventative measures, only the disasters that weren't prevented. That evening, as sunset painted the old farmhouse in shades of amber and gold, Frank sat on his newly restored porch, the bound report open in his lap. On the final page, the research team had included a formal acknowledgement. This recovery of crucial historical information was made possible through the extraordinary loyalty of Sergeant Frank Donovan, USMC retired, who protected this site despite personal cost and public criticism. His dedication to a promise made 50 years ago has preserved an important chapter of American history that would otherwise have been lost forever. Frank closed the book and gazed across the property that had once been his Folly and was now recognized as a national treasure. Somewhere he thought Conrad was allowing himself a rare smile. Type keep word if you believe some people live their entire lives to fulfill a single promise. Frank continued to live at Creekside Farm, firmly rejecting all offers to purchase the property, regardless of the increasingly generous sums proposed. When the National Historic Trust offered to buy it for preservation, Frank's response was characteristically straightforward. I didn't keep it for 50 years to sell it now. I promised to protect it, not profit from it. Instead, he signed a conservation easement that would transfer the property to the trust upon his death, ensuring it would remain preserved in perpetuity without commercial development. 6 months after the initial discovery, Frank received an unexpected honor. In a small ceremony attended by military officials, historians and local residents, who had once questioned his sanity, he was presented with a Civilian Service Medal for extraordinary dedication to preserving critical historical sites and information. The general who pinned the medal to Frank's faded flannel shirt leaned in to whisper, "Men like you make our history worth protecting, Sergeant." Frank accepted the recognition with the same quiet dignity that had characterized his decades of silent guardianship. The medal joined his other decorations in the shoebox rather than being displayed, though he did allow a photograph of the ceremony to be hung in the small visitor center now established at the edge of his property. As word of Creekside's significance spread, Frank's daily routine expanded to include new responsibilities. Each Tuesday and Thursday, local schools brought students to learn about the site's history. Frank initially hesitated to engage with the tours, preferring to work in the background, while professional guides led the explanations. But something changed when he overheard a young guide mistakenly describing Sergeant Conrad as just following orders in establishing the evacuation site. The next day, Frank approached the site director. "I'll talk to them myself from now on," he said firmly. "Not for my sake, for Conrad's, for the real story." Thus began Frank's unexpected third career. After Marine and mechanic, he became a storyteller. Twice weekly, he would sit on the porch with groups of wide-eyed students, describing not the technical aspects of the site, but the men who had created it. Conrad wasn't following anyone's orders when he set this up. He would explain his normally reserved manner, giving way to animated conviction. He was thinking beyond them, beyond what regulations allowed. He saw what might be needed if the worst happened. The children would listen rapt as Frank described how a group of young Marines, most barely older than high school students themselves, had secretly prepared dozens of sites to shelter civilians in case of nuclear attack. "We weren't heroes," he would always insist,
just men who understood that sometimes you have to work outside the system to protect what matters most. A bronze plaque was eventually mounted at the farm's entrance, bearing a simple inscription, "One man kept his word, this place keeps our memory." Under the ancient oak tree where Frank had first uncovered Conrad's buried documents, a stone bench was installed. Engraved on its surface were words taken from Conrad's final letter: "Not everyone comes home, but someone stays behind so the others are not forgotten." As the seasons changed, Frank's perspective on his long guardianship evolved. What had begun as a personal obligation to a fallen friend had transformed into something more profound, a connection between past and future, between individual loyalty and collective memory. On cold mornings when his aging body protested the day's labor, Frank would sometimes sit on Conrad's bench, watching the sun rise over the land he had reclaimed from neglect. In these quiet moments, he often felt a presence beside him, not as a supernatural visitation, but as the natural companionship of a promise kept. "Never expected to be a historian, Jim," he would sometimes murmur. "Thought I was just being stubborn." The broader impact of Frank's dedication continued to ripple outward. By the end of the first year, researchers had located 27 of the 43 sites mentioned in Conrad's record. 17 had already been lost to development or natural reclamation, but 10 remained intact enough to yield valuable historical information. The discovery led to a comprehensive reevaluation of Cold War civilian protection measures, revealing a layer of emergency planning that had existed beyond official documentation. Academic papers were published, curriculum materials developed, and a traveling museum exhibition created. None of this external validation mattered particularly to Frank. His satisfaction came from simpler moments: watching school children trace the outline of the old foundations, hearing visitors read Conrad's words aloud, knowing that his friend's foresight was finally acknowledged. Michael visited from Chicago more frequently now, bringing his own children to meet the grandfather, who had become something of a local legend. During one such visit, Frank's teenage grandson asked the question most adults had been too polite to raise: "Grandpa, did you ever doubt yourself when everyone said you were crazy for buying this place?" Frank considered the question carefully before answering. "Doubt needs options," he said finally. "I never saw this as a choice. A promise is a promise." In the visitor center guestbook, hundreds of entries accumulated from veterans, historians, and ordinary citizens. While many expressed gratitude for the historical preservation, one comment appeared repeatedly in different handwriting, but similar sentiment: "Thank you for showing us that some things still matter more than money or convenience. Some promises are worth keeping, even when no one understands." Frank Donovan continues his quiet stewardship of Creekside Farm, still rising before dawn, still maintaining the property with methodical care. Only now he does so with the knowledge that his lifetime of loyalty has preserved not just a physical location, but a testament to the unwritten acts of duty that often go unrecognized in official histories. Have you ever met someone who lived for an old promise? Despite all doubts, they kept their word as if honor mattered more than life itself. Share the name of someone you know who quietly upheld what was right, despite all skepticism. Subscribe to QH Incredible Stories, where old promises rewrite today's values. Miles stood alone by the fence post one dusky evening, the wind teasing the grass in whispers. He never sought legacy, only peace. But sometimes, in seeking peace, a man lays the foundation for something far greater. What he'd restored wasn't just soil but memory, not just a home, but heritage. And in doing so, he reminded a nation that history doesn't live in textbooks, it lives in quiet fields and brave hearts.